In an age of ideological extremes and reckless political experimentation, we witness the catastrophic consequences of abandoning what classical thinkers recognized as the highest political virtue, prudence. Today's political landscape resembles nothing so much as a battlefield between competing dogmatisms, each claiming monopoly on truth while demonstrating utter contempt for the accumulated wisdom of centuries. The radical progressives demand revolutionary transformation in the name of equality, while reactionary voices call for impossible returns to imagined golden ages. Both factions share a fatal flaw: they have abandoned prudence, that supreme virtue which alone can navigate between the extremes of stagnation and chaos. After decades studying the conservative tradition from my library in Mecosta, examining how great statesmen from Burke to Adams preserved ordered liberty through prudent governance, I have come to understand that prudence is not mere political calculation or timid compromise. It is the master virtue that enables human beings to apply eternal principles to particular circumstances, preserving what deserves preservation while allowing organic development where change serves the common good. Chapter 1: The Nature of Political Prudence. Prudence, which the ancients called phronesis, stands as the virtue that bridges the eternal and the temporal, connecting timeless moral principles with the concrete demands of particular historical moments. Unlike the ideologue who applies abstract theories regardless of circumstances, or the opportunist who abandons principle for expedience, the prudent statesman seeks that delicate balance between fidelity to truth and responsiveness to human need. Political prudence requires what Burke called a disposition to preserve and an ability to improve, recognizing that human societies are complex organisms requiring careful cultivation rather than radical surgery. The prudent mind begins with humility before the complexity of human nature and social relations. Where the ideological temperament sees simple problems requiring simple solutions, prudence acknowledges that political questions involve multiple competing goods, unintended consequences, and the stubborn reality of human limitation. The 6 canons of conservative thought all flow from this prudential recognition. We defend tradition because it embodies tested wisdom. We respect the mystery of human existence because ideological certainty leads to tyranny. We preserve organic unity because forced equality destroys natural harmony. Consider how Burke's prudent response to the French Revolution differed from both reactionary rejection and radical enthusiasm. He neither condemned all change nor embraced revolutionary transformation, but distinguished between reform that preserved constitutional order and revolution that destroyed the social fabric. This required careful attention to particular circumstances, historical precedent, and probable consequences, the essential elements of political prudence. The prudent statesman understands that politics is the art of the possible, not the pursuit of the perfect. This does not mean abandoning high principles, but rather applying them wisely to achieve the best outcomes available in particular circumstances. Prudence teaches us that half a loaf may indeed be better than no bread, that incremental progress often accomplishes more than revolutionary gesture, and that preserving constitutional order sometimes requires tactical compromise to prevent strategic defeat. Modern democracy particularly requires prudential thinking because it operates through persuasion rather than force. The prudent democratic leader must balance competing interests, build consensus around shared principles, and maintain institutional stability while allowing peaceful change. This demands both moral conviction and practical wisdom, both fidelity to truth and sensitivity to human limitation. Chapter 2: The Moral Imagination in Prudential Judgment. Political prudence depends fundamentally upon what I have called the moral imagination, that capacity to perceive the spiritual and ethical dimensions of political questions, to see beyond immediate material interests toward higher purposes that dignify human existence. Without moral imagination, prudence degenerates into mere calculation, policy becomes simple management of competing appetites, and statesmanship reduces to clever manipulation of public opinion. The moral imagination enables us to understand that political decisions affect not merely economic interests or power arrangements, but the very soul of a civilization. When we debate tax policy, we are really asking what obligations we have toward one another and toward future generations. When we consider immigration reform, we are wrestling with questions of national identity, cultural continuity, and human dignity. When we evaluate foreign policy options, we are determining what vision of human flourishing we wish to project to the world. Burke's defense of the American colonists exemplified this moral imagination in action. He saw beyond the immediate questions of taxation and representation to the deeper principles of constitutional liberty and imperial responsibility. His speeches on America were exercises in moral imagination, painting vivid pictures of the consequences that would follow from different policy choices, appealing to Parliament's capacity to envision alternative futures and choose the path that honored both justice and prudence. The moral imagination also enables us to learn from literature, history, and tradition in ways that mere rational analysis cannot achieve. When we read Shakespeare's political plays, we gain insights into the human heart that no political science textbook can provide. When we study the rise and fall of past civilizations, we develop intuitive understanding of the forces that sustain or destroy social order. When we contemplate the wisdom literature of religious traditions, we encounter truths about human nature that transcend particular political arrangements. Modern political discourse suffers from impoverished imagination, reducing complex moral and social questions to simplistic formulas. The progressive imagination sees only oppression and liberation, the libertarian imagination only freedom and coercion, the nationalist imagination only sovereignty and submission. Each represents a partial truth elevated to comprehensive dogma, blinding adherence to the full complexity of human experience. Prudential judgment requires what Coleridge called the whole man, reason informed by imagination, principle guided by experience, conviction tempered by humility. Only when we engage our full human capacities can we hope to make political decisions worthy of beings created in the divine image. Chapter 3: Tradition as Democracy of the Dead. The prudent statesman recognizes that political wisdom emerges not from abstract reasoning alone, but from the accumulated experience of countless generations who have grappled with the permanent problems of human existence. What Chesterton brilliantly called the democracy of the dead reminds us that we are not the first to face questions of justice, order, and liberty, nor are we likely to be the wisest. Prudence therefore begins with reverent attention to the voices of the past, seeking to understand how previous generations solved similar problems before attempting innovations of our own. This reverence for tradition is not antiquarian sentimentality or stubborn resistance to necessary change. Rather, it represents recognition that political arrangements which have sustained civilized life across centuries embody insights that transcend the limitations of any particular moment or individual perspective. The British Constitution, American federalism, the common law tradition, these did not emerge from theoretical speculation but from practical experience, refined through trial and error, tested against the stubborn realities of human nature and social need. Consider how the American founders drew upon classical antiquity, medieval constitutionalism, and modern political philosophy in crafting their revolutionary experiment in republican government. They did not reject the past but sought to preserve its best insights while correcting its evident defects. The Constitution itself represents prudential synthesis, combining ancient wisdom about separation of powers with modern understanding of representation, balancing federal unity with state diversity, protecting individual rights while maintaining social order. The prudent approach to tradition recognizes the difference between living tradition and dead traditionalism. Living tradition continues to grow and develop, applying established principles to new circumstances while preserving essential insights. Dead traditionalism merely repeats past forms without understanding their animating spirit, becoming rigid ideology that cannot adapt to changed conditions. Burke exemplified living tradition in his support for the American colonists. He defended ancient English liberties by opposing policies that violated constitutional precedent. Take a moment to consider, what wisdom have we inherited from our ancestors about the perennial challenges of political life? How might their experience inform our contemporary struggles with questions of representation, accountability, and the proper scope of government power? The democracy of the dead votes not for particular policies but for tested principles that have proven their worth across generations. Modern democratic culture tends toward temporal chauvinism, assuming that whatever is newest must be best, that previous generations were merely stepping stones to our enlightened present. Prudence corrects this arrogance by recognizing that moral and political wisdom does not progress like technological innovation. The fundamental insights about human nature, social order, and political justice remain constant across centuries, though their application must be adjusted to particular circumstances. Chapter 4: Transcendent Order and Political Authority. Political prudence ultimately rests upon recognition that human government derives its authority not from popular will alone, but from conformity to a transcendent moral order that exists independently of human preference or social convention. Without acknowledgement of standards that transcend temporal power, politics inevitably degenerates into mere struggle between competing factions, with victory going to whoever can mobilize superior force or manipulation. The prudent statesman therefore seeks to align human law with divine law, temporal authority with eternal justice. This transcendent dimension distinguishes genuine conservatism from mere reaction or self-interest. The conservative defends private property not because the wealthy deserve special privilege, but because ownership reflects the human dignity that comes from being created in God's image. The conservative supports traditional marriage not from prejudice against alternative arrangements, but because the family represents the fundamental social unit through which civilization transmits its values across generations. The conservative advocates limited government not from anarchistic impulse, but because political power must be constrained by higher law to prevent tyranny. History demonstrates repeatedly that societies which reject transcendent authority inevitably fall into despotism or anarchy. The French revolutionaries' attempt to ground politics in pure reason led to the terror. The communist experiment in creating heaven on earth produced unprecedented oppression. The Nazi effort to create political order based on will to power resulted in civilizational catastrophe. Each represents prudence's opposite, ideological hubris that refuses to acknowledge limits on human political authority. American constitutionalism succeeded because it recognized both the necessity and the limits of government power. The founders acknowledged that human beings require political authority to prevent chaos, but they also understood that such authority must be constrained by constitutional law, separated into competing branches, and limited by recognition of inalienable rights that no government may violate. This represents prudential balance between order and liberty, authority and freedom. The prudent statesman therefore approaches political questions with appropriate humility, recognizing that human wisdom is limited and human power corrupts. Political decisions must be evaluated not merely by their immediate practical consequences, but by their conformity to moral standards that transcend political calculation. This does not mean imposing religious orthodoxy, but rather maintaining that political authority must answer to conscience and moral law. Religious faith provides the most secure foundation for this transcendent perspective, but even those who cannot embrace traditional belief may recognize the practical necessity of acknowledging moral standards beyond political manipulation. The alternative is unlimited government power constrained only by shifting public opinion, a formula for eventual tyranny regardless of democratic forms. Chapter 5: Natural Diversity and Organic Society. The prudent understanding of politics recognizes that human equality before the law and in fundamental dignity does not require uniformity in condition, function, or achievement. Indeed, a healthy society requires what we might call equality in inequality, equal opportunity to develop one's particular talents in service of the common good, rather than forced leveling that destroys the natural diversity through which communities flourish. Political prudence therefore seeks to preserve and nurture legitimate differences while preventing illegitimate discrimination. Human beings are not interchangeable units in some vast social machine, but unique individuals with particular gifts, interests, and vocations. A prudent political order recognizes and honors these differences, creating space for the scholar and the craftsman, the entrepreneur and the artist, the contemplative and the activist. Attempts to force everyone into identical molds, whether in the name of equality, efficiency, or ideological purity, violate human nature and impoverish social life. Consider the organic complexity of a healthy community: farmers who understand the land, merchants who facilitate exchange, teachers who transmit knowledge, clergy who tend souls, physicians who heal bodies, artists who uplift spirits, leaders who coordinate efforts toward common purposes. Each contributes something essential that others cannot provide. Forced equality would eliminate these beneficial differences, creating drab uniformity that serves no one well. The prudent statesman therefore resists both aristocratic privilege that prevents merit from rising and egalitarian leveling that prevents excellence from emerging. Instead, prudence seeks what Burke called a true natural aristocracy, leadership based on virtue, wisdom, and service rather than mere birth or wealth. This requires educational institutions that identify and cultivate talent regardless of social origin, economic arrangements that reward productive contribution, and political structures that enable the best to serve the common good. Take a moment to reflect on your own unique contributions to community life. What particular gifts do you possess that others need? How might you develop these talents more fully in service of purposes larger than yourself? Prudent politics creates conditions where such individual flourishing serves community welfare rather than undermining social bonds. Modern egalitarian ideology treats all differences as oppression and all distinctions as discrimination, leading to destructive attempts to eliminate natural variety through governmental force. This not only fails to achieve its stated goals but actually increases genuine injustice by preventing society from benefiting from the full range of human talents. Prudence prefers organic development that allows natural differences to emerge while ensuring that such differences serve the common good rather than creating permanent castes or arbitrary privilege. The result is neither rigid hierarchy nor anarchic equality, but dynamic community where individuals find their proper place through the natural operation of talent, effort, and social need guided by moral principle and constitutional law. Chapter 6: Political Prudence versus Ideological Radicalism. The fundamental distinction between prudential politics and ideological radicalism lies in their opposing approaches to the relationship between theory and practice, between ideal and reality, between aspiration and achievement. The ideological temperament begins with abstract theories about how society ought to function and attempts to force reality to conform to these preconceived notions, regardless of historical experience, human nature, or unintended consequences. Prudence, by contrast, begins with careful observation of how human beings actually behave in particular circumstances and seeks gradual improvements that work with rather than against the grain of human nature and social development. Revolutionary ideology, whether of the left or right, shares certain fatal characteristics. It promises perfect solutions to permanent problems. It reduces complex social questions to simple formulas. It treats opposition as moral evil rather than honest disagreement, and it justifies present suffering in the name of future happiness. The communist promised workers' paradise justified mass murder. The fascist promised national greatness legitimized aggressive war. The democratic radical promises social justice through unlimited expansion of governmental power. Each represents what Burke identified as the fundamental error of the revolutionary spirit, the attempt to rebuild society from the ground up according to abstract principles, destroying existing institutions without adequate understanding of their function or consideration of what might replace them. This theoretical approach ignores the crucial insight that political arrangements which have evolved over centuries embody practical wisdom about human nature and social need that no individual theorist can comprehend. Prudential politics proceeds differently. It begins with existing institutions and asks how they might be gradually improved to better serve human flourishing. It preserves what works while carefully reforming what causes genuine harm. It prefers tested remedies to experimental ones, incremental progress to revolutionary transformation, constitutional process to extra-legal action. Most importantly, it maintains healthy skepticism about human capacity to predict or control complex social outcomes. Consider the difference between prudent civil rights reform and radical social transformation. The prudent approach, exemplified by leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., appealed to existing constitutional principles and moral traditions, seeking to extend their application rather than overthrow the entire system. This strategy succeeded because it worked with American ideals rather than against them, building broad coalition around shared values rather than demanding revolutionary change. Revolutionary approaches, by contrast, typically generate counter-revolution because they threaten too many legitimate interests too quickly. They create instability that often produces outcomes opposite to their stated intentions, as we see repeatedly in societies that have attempted rapid social transformation through governmental force. The prudent statesman therefore prefers the slower but surer path of organic development, recognizing that lasting change must grow from within communities rather than being imposed from above by ideological elites who think they know better than the accumulated wisdom of generations. Chapter 7: The Permanent Things in Political Life. In the final analysis, political prudence serves to preserve and transmit what I have called the permanent things, those enduring truths about human nature, moral obligation, and social order that transcend particular historical epochs and cultural arrangements. These permanent things include the dignity of human persons created in the divine image, the necessity of moral law as the foundation of just government, the importance of family and community as the natural units of social life, the value of tradition as accumulated wisdom, and the role of transcendent purpose in giving meaning to temporal existence. The great challenge of political prudence is applying these permanent truths to ever-changing circumstances without either abandoning them to passing fashion or reducing them to rigid dogma. This requires what Newman called development of doctrine, growth in understanding that preserves essential insights while expressing them in ways appropriate to new conditions. Constitutional government itself represents such development, preserving ancient insights about the rule of law while adapting them to modern democratic conditions. Throughout the turbulent centuries since the rise of modern ideology, we have witnessed repeated attempts to replace the permanent things with temporary enthusiasms: nationalism, socialism, fascism, progressivism, libertarianism, each promising to solve the human condition through political means. All have failed because they ignore or reject fundamental truths about human nature and social reality that cannot be altered by governmental decree or social engineering. The permanent things endure not because they are imposed by authority, but because they correspond to the deepest structures of reality itself. Attempts to violate them inevitably produce consequences that force their recognition. Societies that reject moral law discover that legal coercion cannot replace ethical obligation. Cultures that abandon family life find that no institutional substitute can provide the formation children need. Nations that cut themselves off from their traditions lose the wisdom necessary for prudent governance. Political prudence therefore serves as guardian of civilizational memory, ensuring that each generation receives the inheritance of wisdom accumulated by its predecessors while contributing its own insights to the great conversation that spans the centuries. This requires institutions dedicated to liberal education, cultural transmission, and the cultivation of those habits of mind and heart that enable free people to govern themselves responsibly. The conservative political tradition at its best has always served this guardianship function, defending the permanent things against the temporary fashions that would destroy them. This is why conservative politics is ultimately hopeful despite its realistic assessment of human limitation. It knows that truth endures even when temporarily obscured, that justice ultimately prevails even when temporarily defeated, that the permanent things reassert themselves even after periods of eclipse. Each of us bears responsibility for this great work of conservation and transmission, contributing our small part to preserving the civilization that makes human flourishing possible. Political prudence is ultimately about ensuring that future generations inherit not ruins but a living tradition capable of guiding them through their own challenges while remaining faithful to the permanent things that give life meaning and purpose. Conclusion. Political prudence emerges not from cleverness or calculation, but from humble recognition that human beings require both order and freedom, both stability and change, both individual dignity and social responsibility. The prudent statesman seeks that delicate balance which preserves what deserves preservation while allowing organic development where improvement serves the common good. This requires both moral conviction and practical wisdom, both fidelity to eternal principles and sensitivity to temporal circumstances. In our age of ideological extremes, when political discourse too often degenerates into tribal warfare, the recovery of prudence offers our best hope for renewing constitutional government and preserving ordered liberty. The permanent things call us beyond partisan passion toward the patient work of building civilization that honors human dignity while acknowledging human limitation. This is the true conservative mission, not mere opposition to change, but prudent stewardship of the inheritance that makes genuine progress possible while remaining faithful to the transcendent order that gives politics its proper purpose.